Okay, for once I'm actually making some holster patterns that I don't have to have the holster for somebody as a custom order. I recently acquired some blue guns. Blue guns, I'm using the term blue gun, which is a brand name, but it's actually, there's other brands as well. The blue gun ones are actually blue, but they're molded from particular firearms, and they are the exact same size and shape, so professional holster makers a lot of times will use these to shape their holsters rather than the actual firearms. Now, most hobbyists will be just making a holster for themselves. They'll use their own firearm that they want to make the holster for. But in this case, I picked up a few of these, and I'm making holster patterns for them, and just kind of figuring out my patterns. So hopefully in the future, if I have to make some of these, I've already got patterns ready to go. And of course, I'll probably put patterns up on our Etsy page and sell them to people once I know that I've got a good pattern that works. But anyway, what I'm working on today is not this one in particular. It's actually one of them that's not blue. It's this other yellowish colored one, which I think was a Cook's Firearm Simulators or Cook's Gun Molds was the name of the brand. It's got a few blemishes, but they won't matter for holster making. But this is a molded from a Springfield Hellcat 9mm, which popular concealed carry option right now. So I decided, since I keep hearing about this at the gun store and all these guys are talking about getting them, I'll go ahead and come up with some holster patterns for this. Is this pattern I've got here, which Hellcat Pancake is just an awesome name. But basically it's going to be a pancake style holster. I've got two pieces that are going to be the lining and two pieces that are going to be the back plate and the front plate of the holster. They're all cut out of the same piece of leather, so I just cut them all. Cut these both the same way. And got these both reversed. So I'm going to go ahead in this video and put this holster together, and then we'll see if I did it right and if the mold fits. Okay, so first things first, let's lay out some stitching grooves, bevel some edges, a little bit of beveling some edges, not much. I want a stitching groove that runs from over here to over here. Just across the top of that upper part of that back piece. And we're going to run a stitching groove across the bottom mouth of the holster. Well, it'll be important later. And on this piece, we're going to need a stitching groove most of the way around it. Or actually basically all the way around it. Now we've got these slots that are going to be cut in the pattern. I'm just going to go ahead and punch some holes out for those, so I know where everything's going to be. We may cut them out in a little bit. I've just marked them on there with little tiny pinpricks with the scratch all through the paper. So they're not really easy to see. But I don't like marking on the front of pieces of leather with ink pens or anything like that, because unless you're dyeing the piece black, it may come back to bite you later if you got a wayward mark of ink. Now, we've got some other stitch lines on our pattern, besides those stitch grooves across there. This one runs down and around, which should match up with that outer one, but then there's a line that runs across here for the trigger guard. And there's a line that runs across here on the sight side of it. And that'll merge into these stitch lines. Now this one, I'm just going to have to freehand a little bit. Which actually, I've got a freehand stitching groover somewhere. So I don't have to use this one freehand, but you can. Let me grab this little tool. Handy little thing. Basically, it's the same out there on the tip of it as what this has on it. And you just use it sort of like a pencil. I think this has since been replaced with other tools. I don't know if it still exists. I think last time I was at a Tandy store, they had a replacement for this. It looks a little different, but it's basically the same tool. Now, just because I can and I don't have any particular person I'm making this for, I'm going to go ahead and wet it down and stamp something on it. I'm probably going to use a basket weave tool of some sort. Got one picked out here that's a little different than what I normally use. This little one is a square basket weave tool. It's just kind of used by doing one impression this way and then turning it 90 degrees and doing another one. And just following a line. Go ahead and put some tape on the back of this so it doesn't stretch out, because I'm using 2 layers of 4 to 5 ounce leather back to back. Get it on there to make about 8 to 9 to start, or 8 to 10 ounce when it's going to be done. But it's kind of thin to start with, and I don't want to stretch this out too much. So let's go ahead and put just clear packing tape. Can save you some hassle of having to deal with leather that no longer fits the shape you want it to. I could probably just go along that line and work my way out from it. That's a fairly straight line. On this tool, that should do the job. Normally I would go and try and do something like right through the middle and work out from it. But this isn't a huge area. I think I can get away with this time. Let's reposition. The real trick on this pattern is making sure when you come back down here that you got the tool turned the right direction. Otherwise, it's just remember to turn 90 degrees each time. Okay, now back to our overhead view. Let's go ahead and cut out these, at least on the front piece, where these slots are going to be for the belt loops. I won't actually cut them out of this back piece until after I've got them sewn together. Because you can never quite get them to line up right if you try and cut them exact ahead of time. Now in this case I'm going to use kind of a two-step process. I want to use an antique stain on these, but I think I'll use a dye and then an antique stain, and that gives you a deeper sort of finish to it. I think it really enhances the color a lot if you do both of them. So we're going to start with a light brown dye, and then we're going to use a medium brown antique over top of it after the dye is thoroughly dried. And this is Herman oak leather, so it's really thirsty. You got to go over it several times with the dye before it starts to get an even coat of it. Another thing about dyeing leather is that you want to keep going until you get it even. You don't want to let it dry between coats. Basically, what I find works really well, it'll be a lot darker to start with, but then you let it dry all the way, you'll be the color you actually want it to be usually. As long as you got the right dye for what you're trying to do. But you want to go until it leaves these puddles behind, and you're able to overlap them with ones that are still there from the previous line. So like this isn't quite yet there, it's still soaking up a lot of dye. But like I said, on this stuff it's 3 or 4 coats usually, and then it'll start to leave these nice flooded puddles of dye behind. So like I said, you're kind of overlapping it before it entirely goes away. And on most leathers, that's when you'll get a nice even finish with it. But as you can definitely see, this is light brown, which usually dries this color, and it's this dark when it goes on. So you gotta let it go ahead and dry through the various stages. It may not wind up as light as the other one, but you can see some of the first pieces I did are already getting lighter. So I'll let that dry several hours. I'll probably actually stop for the night and come back to it tomorrow. And that should be good and dry then. Okay, now that you can see that it's dried, it's gone back to this nice light color. Everything's completely dry, nice even colors. We're going to go over it with some antique stain, medium brown in this case. I'm just going to use sheep wool scraps for that, as I do with a lot of things. And I'm wearing gloves for this because this is messy. Just rub it on there until you get it even. And sort of polish off any excess with, in this case, I'm just using a paper towel. Now if we go over with a damp paper towel, we can kind of wet it down a little bit. Take a little bit more of that antique stain back off. So kind of the color of the dye shines through a little bit more. Not as much as if I would have resisted it. But I think it makes a neat effect. Okay, now that this has had a chance to dry, you can start to see the color come through. I'm just going to go over it with some leather sheen spray and lock all that in and finish it up. This is my preferred finish for anything that I use antique stains on for the most part, because you don't smear the antique all over the place like you would with a wipe-on finish. Okay, now that all the pieces are dry, it's time to get this glued up. Got a can of glue that's almost empty. I've got kind of laying out here. And we're just gonna pour some on there and spread it out. I find using a scrap of leather or something similar is a good way to cover a large area fast with contact cement. You can also get plastic scrapers that are used for fiberglass and things like that. Works really well as well. Now, unlike these other pieces, which I can just slop glue on and spread it around, this piece I need to be a little bit more careful because I've got the slots cut out of it that I don't get too much glue all over the place. So I actually get the brush out for that, the brush that comes in the lid of the can. Pancake style holsters are nice and easy to assemble. You can just start with everything flat. But anyway, now that this is trimmed up, there's a couple places it needs to be stitched before I stitch it all together. Across the top of the holster, across the bottom here. And those places will also need to have their edges finished. Not necessarily before I do the other part, because I'll still be able to get to like this edge pretty easily. But I want to probably finish the edges right down here at the bottom of the holster, the toe of it, and right here at the holster mouth. I probably want to finish that up before I go ahead and put everything together. So I'm going to go ahead and edge bevel those. I'll probably go around with some dye all the way around the edges, but we're going to slick this and get it ready to go right in that area. Now, like I said, let's go ahead and dye these edges at least through there. I'll probably go all the way around and then have to touch them back up after I sand it. But let's dye through there and finish this edge and the bottom of the holster here. And for just the edges there, I'm using a really dark brown dye that's called Show Brown. It's one of the oil dyes. Alright, now that I've got those edges nice and finished up, it's time to take this downstairs and do some stitching. And I'll have to stitch on that piece, and this piece, and then here and here on this piece, before I stitch it all together. And then I'll take it and grind all the edges even, and bring it back and probably do more dyeing and burnishing edges all the way around. And I have to cut these pieces out still as well. Okay, now that I've got it all stitched together, stitched around the edges, it's starting to look a little bit more like a holster. Look a lot more like it once we get it shaped. But I need to punch these out, cut these out, and bevel all these edges again, because I've sanded them to where they meet each other. So I'll have to bevel them, go back over and touch them up with some dye and some gum tragacanth, and then we'll be able to finish that up and slick it down. Trim knife can be used to finish up some of these cuts. Make them a little smoother. Okay, a little bit of cutting with the round knife, a little bit of carving with the trim knife. And we got this all where we want it to be. Go around with the edge beveler on that, just in case there's a spot that I flattened out. There's a little bit of one. And of course on the back it still needs to be beveled. Alright, now let's touch up our edges. Alright, gum drag to finish the edges. And then it'll just be a matter of shaping this, and since I'm making this to something I actually have a pattern for, an actual blue gun, well, yellow gun in this case, I'll be able to shape it pretty precisely right here. Okay, so I soaked this in water for 2 or 3 minutes and then pulled it out and left it here on the bench for about 5 or so. There's kind of a fine line to walk if you don't want to wash out your tooling and stretch it out. You don't want it too wet, but you want the water to be deep into the leather so the fibers of the leather are flexible. So you can see it does move and flex some, but it's still pretty firm here on the surface. That's kind of what I was looking for. It's like I said, a fine line to walk, easy to mess up, one way or the other. But we should be able to shape this. Probably not to the point that you'll see every contour of the firearm, like you would in some mass manufactured holsters. Something like that, if you want that appearance, you're going to have to probably, first off, not line it. Like most of those manufacturers don't line it. And then it'll be easier to get the contours to show up. But you'll also probably not want to tool or stamp on it, because you'll damage your tooling or stamping trying to get those contours. And those contours are really just aesthetic. So I prefer, for my aesthetics, having stamping on it, or carving or tooling or whatever you want to call it, rather than having the contours of the firearm. But to each their own on that. And sometimes it helps, and what I do a lot of times with the actual firearm that I'm shaping to, if it's a real one instead of a simulator like this, is I'll wrap it up in saran wrap, and that gives you a little bit extra room. And I may still do that on this one as well, just to smooth out some of the lumps and bumps, give myself some extra room in there. Because otherwise things like these ridges that are on the slide for being able to cock it easier will catch on the leather, and the leather will shape into them and make it a little harder to draw. But that's the basic idea. Gonna need to give it probably a full day to dry, and then I'll take the final pictures of what it looks like when it's done.